The Supreme Court chamber was completely silent. Every sound seemed to echo through the tall marble walls. Reporters stopped typing. Spectators leaned forward. Even the air felt heavy, as if the room itself knew something historic was about to happen. Then, breaking that thick silence, came a voice deep and commanding. It was Justice Clarence Thomas. "Congresswoman," he said slowly, each word firm, "you have yet to show any real limit on Congress's power under your interpretation." At the podium stood Representative Jasmine Crockett. She gripped the wooden stand tightly. Her eyes stayed fixed on the bench in front of her. For almost 30 minutes, Thomas had interrupted her again and again. This was now his 8th interruption. Each time she tried to respond, his deep voice came again, questioning, pressing, cutting off her words. The tension was thick. The courtroom was no longer just a place of law. It had become a battlefield of ideas. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Tell me, Congresswoman," he said, "if Congress can decide what equal protection means, what stops it from changing the Constitution whenever politics shift?" The words echoed across the chamber. A few people gasped quietly. Every person in the room understood what was happening. This wasn't just a normal day at the court. It was a test of power between two people who stood for very different visions of the Constitution. On one side was Justice Thomas, one of the most senior and conservative justices on the bench, a man known for his belief that the Constitution should be read exactly as it was written centuries ago. On the other was Representative Jasmine Crockett, a younger lawmaker, a constitutional attorney before she was elected to Congress, who believed the document should live and adapt to modern realities. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Cameras from the press pool clicked softly. Chief Justice John Roberts looked up from his notes. Justice Kagan glanced toward Thomas, her expression unreadable. Justice Kavanaugh tapped his pen. It was as if the entire court was holding its breath. Jasmine Crockett took a slow breath and then began to speak. Her voice was calm, steady, but there was a firmness beneath it, the sound of someone who knew she was standing on solid ground. "Justice Thomas," she said, "the limitation you're asking for already exists. This court itself set it in Bourne versus Flores." Thomas's face remained still, but his eyes narrowed slightly. The courtroom leaned in. Crockett continued, her tone respectful but confident. "That case made it clear. Congress can act under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment only when its laws are proportional and directly related to real constitutional violations. That's exactly what this law does. We have more than 850 pages of evidence, testimony and documents showing that states have repeatedly undermined equal protection rights." The room was utterly silent, the kind of silence that demands attention. Chief Justice Roberts looked over toward Thomas. Justice Kagan's eyebrows lifted slightly. Justice Kavanaugh began turning through his notes page after page. Even Justice Thomas, known for his calm and sometimes distant manner, appeared momentarily still. It was rare, very rare, for anyone to challenge Thomas so directly and hold their ground. Before we go deeper into this remarkable exchange between two brilliant legal minds, take a moment to comment below where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part of this story. Now let's go back to how this moment came to be and why it matters. Jasmine Crockett was not an ordinary politician. Long before she ever ran for Congress, she was a constitutional lawyer. She had spent years studying the limits of government power, arguing in front of federal courts and writing briefs that dissected constitutional law with precision. Her colleagues in Congress often described her as serious, methodical, and prepared for every hearing. When she entered politics, she brought that same discipline with her. While others chased media attention, Crockett focused on details, on laws, and on principles. She had once said during her campaign, "Constitutional interpretation isn't about party lines, it's about consistency. The promises in the Constitution have to mean something, even when times change. That statement captured who she was, a believer in both progress and principle. Justice Clarence Thomas, on the other hand, had followed a completely different road. Appointed to the Supreme Court in 1991 after one of the most contentious confirmation hearings in history, Thomas had spent decades shaping the court's conservative philosophy. He was known for his originalist view, the belief that the Constitution should be interpreted as it was understood when it was written, not as society evolved. For many years, Thomas had remained mostly silent during oral arguments, often going entire sessions without asking a single question. But recently that had changed. He had become more vocal, more insistent, more willing to press his points in public. And today he was doing just that. The case before the court that day was called Alabama versus the United States. It involved the Voting Rights Advancement Act, a new law written to restore federal oversight of certain state election rules, oversight that had been weakened by the court's earlier decision in Shelby County v. Holder. The law's goal was simple, to stop states from passing voting laws that unfairly discriminated, but the constitutional question was far more complicated. Under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, Congress has the power to enforce equal protection through appropriate legislation. The question was how far that power went. Could Congress decide what counts as an equal protection violation, or was that the job of the courts alone? That question, one that had troubled scholars for decades, now stood at the center of this dramatic courtroom battle. As the hearing began, Chief Justice Roberts opened the session with his usual calm. We'll hear argument this morning in case number 23-741, Alabama versus the United States. Representative Crockett, you may proceed. Crockett stepped up to the podium, adjusted her notes, and began. Her voice carried clearly across the room. Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, she began. Section 5 of the 14th Amendment gives Congress the authority to pass laws that protect citizens' right to equal protection. The Voting Rights Advancement Act is exactly that, a constitutional response to real violations. For several minutes she spoke with clarity and confidence. She explained how Congress had gathered thousands of pages of evidence, showing real cases where states had passed laws that made voting harder for minorities. Her sentences were calm and deliberate, like a teacher explaining a complex subject in simple language. Justice Amy Coney Barrett spoke first. Representative Crockett, she said, how is this law different from the one struck down in Shelby County? Doesn't it bring back federal control in almost the same way? Crockett smiled politely. Justice Barrett, she replied, the difference lies in the evidence. The old law was based on data that was 40 years old. This one uses fresh, modern information, evidence from the last 25 years. We're not reviving old rules. We're addressing current violations. Justice Barrett nodded slightly, as if considering the point. Justice Kagan followed with another question about how the law would be enforced. Crockett explained that the new law created 3 levels of oversight, applying stricter rules only where states had been proven to break the law repeatedly. Her calm precision impressed even skeptical justices. Then the silence broke again. Justice Thomas leaned in. His voice, low and deep, filled the chamber. Representative Crockett, he said, your interpretation gives Congress extraordinary power. Where exactly is the limit? And there it was, the start of what would become one of the most intense constitutional exchanges in recent Supreme Court history. Crockett began to answer, but before she could finish, Thomas interrupted. If Congress itself decides the limit, then there is no limit, he said. And if the courts decide it, then nothing has changed. Either way, Congress is trying to redefine what equal protection means. Crockett tried again, speaking carefully. The balance, Justice Thomas, is shared. Congress identifies the patterns of violations through fact-finding, and the court ensures those remedies match the Constitution's meaning. It's a dialogue, not domination, Thomas interrupted again. That still gives Congress too much power. What stops Congress from redefining constitutional rights through so-called facts? Crockett didn't flinch. Her response was quick and sharp. Congress cannot create new rights, Justice Thomas. It can only protect the ones this court has already recognized. That's what this law does. But Thomas pressed harder, challenging her citations, her reasoning, her examples. One interruption followed another. Each time Crockett's patience and professionalism held, the crowd could feel the rising tension. After his 8th interruption, Thomas raised his voice slightly. Congresswoman, you've still not shown one clear limit. What stops Congress from changing the meaning of the Constitution itself? The room went still again. The weight of history seemed to hang in the air. Crockett paused, lifted her head and spoke slowly. Justice Thomas, the limitation you're looking for is right here, in your own court's decision in Bourne versus Flores. This law follows that rule exactly. It's congruent, it's proportional, and it's based on real proven violations. The limit isn't missing. It's already built into your own precedent. For the first time that morning, Thomas said nothing. His face was unreadable. The courtroom seemed frozen in that single moment of silence. Chief Justice Roberts glanced toward him. Justice Kagan leaned back, her eyes thoughtful. Even Kavanaugh stopped writing. Everyone in that room, that from seasoned lawyers to first-time visitors, knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. What had begun as a clash between a veteran justice and a new congresswoman had turned into something deeper, a rare, honest dialogue about the heart of the Constitution itself. But this was only the beginning. The exchange that would follow would shake the quiet walls of the Supreme Court and leave a mark on American legal history. Because after that silence, Clarence Thomas leaned forward again. His next words would change everything. The air inside the Supreme Court chamber was thick, almost electric. The crowd sat still, frozen in that moment between silence and storm. Then Thomas spoke. His voice was deep and steady, but there was something different this time, less confrontation, more curiosity. Representative Crockett, he began slowly, if we assume the standard from Bourne versus Flores is the right one, how do you explain the parts of this law that go beyond the violations you described? Sections 5 and 6, for instance. Don't they reach further than the specific problems Congress found? It was not an interruption this time. It was a question, a real one. The shift was small but powerful. Reporters noticed. Lawyers noticed. Even the justices themselves seemed to lean forward. After 8 interruptions filled with tension, this was the first time Justice Thomas asked to listen. Jasmine Crockett felt it. She steadied herself, then answered. Her voice stayed calm but confident. Justice Thomas, those sections are proportional to the scope of the violations. The record shows that where states repeatedly violated equal protection, broader remedies were necessary. That's exactly what this court recognized in Hibbs versus Nevada Department of Human Resources. Persistent violations justify broader preventive measures. The law isn't trying to control the states. It's trying to stop the same harm from happening again. For a moment, the courtroom was silent again. Thomas looked down at his notes. He was listening carefully. The audience could sense that the tone of this argument had changed completely. What had started as a clash was now turning into a dialogue, a real intellectual conversation about the Constitution itself. Justice Samuel Alito spoke next. Representative Crockett, he said, his voice level, assuming we accept your reasoning, how does this tiered system you mentioned actually ensure proportionality? Isn't there still a risk that some states face heavier oversight than others? Crockett nodded slightly. Justice Alito, she said, that's a fair question. The law uses a 3-tier structure. The first tier covers states with the most serious and repeated violations. The second includes those with occasional problems. The third applies to those that show only minor or historical issues. Each level has matching remedies. The worst violators face closer oversight, while those with clean records face none at all. And there's a bailout rule. Any state can prove improvement and leave federal supervision. Alito looked thoughtful. So you're saying the law adjusts itself based on each state's actions? Yes, Crockett replied. It rewards compliance, not punishes sovereignty. It respects the principle of equal treatment while protecting citizens' constitutional rights. Her words were clear and simple, but they carried weight. You didn't need a law degree to understand her. She wasn't talking like a politician. She was talking like a teacher, explaining fairness to her students. That tone, the mix of strength and patience, was reaching everyone in the room. Justice Amy Coney Barrett joined in again. You mentioned the bailout rule, she said. How is this one different from the old version that this court struck down years ago in Northwest Austin? Crockett turned a page in her binder. The old bailout rule was almost impossible to meet, she said. It required states to prove a perfect record with no issues at all. This new one is practical. It focuses on real improvement, on showing good faith and consistent compliance. A state doesn't have to be flawless, only committed to fairness. The law allows progress to be recognized. Barrett nodded slightly. Her question had been met with a precise, simple answer. And once again all eyes turned to Justice Thomas. He leaned back in his chair. He tapped his pen against the desk twice before speaking again. Representative Crockett, he said, I understand your point about proportionality, but there's another issue. Section 3B4 of this Act uses what appears to be a results-based test. Doesn't that go beyond what the Constitution itself requires? Aren't you creating new standards that the 14th Amendment never mentioned? Crockett listened carefully. Then she replied, Justice Thomas, Section 3B4 doesn't change the Constitution's standard. It uses the same framework this court described in Village of Arlington Heights. That case explained that sometimes discrimination isn't written into a law. It's hidden behind it. It's shown through patterns, history, and outcomes. Section 3B4 uses those same clues to identify when a practice crosses the line. It doesn't create new rights. It protects old ones. Thomas tilted his head slightly. But Arlington Heights dealt with proving intent, not outcomes, he said. Isn't your law turning that intent test into a results test? Crockett smiled politely. Not at all, Justice Thomas. Intent can be seen through results, when those results keep happening under the same conditions. The law still requires proof of intent. It just allows courts to infer intent when the evidence is overwhelming. It's a bridge between reality and legal theory. The courtroom was silent again. Reporters could barely type fast enough. This was no longer the usual back and forth of lawyers and judges. This was something deeper, a rare, honest conversation about how America defines fairness. Chief Justice Roberts leaned forward next. Representative Crockett, he said, one of the concerns here is separation of powers. If Congress can pass laws based on its own idea of constitutional violations, doesn't that shift the balance of interpretation away from this court? Crockett met his gaze. Mr. Chief Justice, she said, Congress is not trying to interpret the Constitution differently from the court. We're applying your interpretations to real-life facts. We take your rulings as the standard, and then we use our fact-finding power to identify where those standards are being violated. Congress doesn't redefine equal protection, it enforces it. There was a pause. Roberts nodded slowly. It was a rare thing to see. A Chief Justice openly impressed. Around the courtroom, the energy had completely changed. The earlier tension was gone, replaced by deep focus. The audience wasn't just watching a legal debate. They were witnessing a meeting of minds. When the arguments ended, Chief Justice Roberts thanked her formally. The court appreciates your clarity, Representative Crockett, he said. Your presentation was thorough. Crockett gathered her papers and stepped away from the podium. As she left, Justice Thomas's eyes followed her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Some saw curiosity, others saw respect. But everyone saw that something had shifted. Outside the courtroom, the media waited. Reporters crowded around her as soon as she stepped down the marble steps. Cameras flashed. Microphones reached toward her face. Someone shouted, "Representative Crockett, how do you think it went?" Crockett stopped for a moment. Her answer was short and calm. "The court asked good questions," she said. "That's how democracy works. Debate is not division, it's how we find truth." Then she smiled, nodded politely, and walked away into the crowd. That night, the entire country was talking about what had happened. News anchors called it the most intense Supreme Court exchange in a decade. Some saw it as a clash between generations. Others saw it as a rare moment of genuine respect between opposing sides. Commentators on both the left and right couldn't stop replaying that moment, Justice Thomas interrupting, Crockett holding her ground, and the final silence that changed everything. Even legal scholars admitted that something unusual had taken place inside that marble courtroom. A well-known legal analyst said on live television, "I've covered the Supreme Court for 20 years, and I've never seen Clarence Thomas shift from confrontation to curiosity in the middle of an argument." Representative Crockett did that. In law schools across the country, professors began showing clips from the hearing to their students. They paused the video right after the 8th interruption. "Watch this part," one professor said. "This is how you stay calm under pressure. This is how you argue with principle, not emotion." For weeks, the country debated what would happen next. Would the court strike down the law? Would they uphold it? And had Justice Thomas, known for his strong opinions, actually changed his mind? Behind closed doors, the justices began their private discussions. Each one had their own notes, their own impressions. Chief Justice Roberts believed Crockett had made a strong case. Justice Kagan admired her precision. Justice Alito saw merit but worried about scope. Justice Barrett was thoughtful, cautious. And Justice Thomas, he was quiet. For a man known for clear, strong positions, that silence meant something. Meanwhile, back in her office on Capitol Hill, Jasmine Crockett continued her work. She didn't give interviews. She didn't post on social media. She spent her evenings reviewing more legal briefs and preparing for what came next. Her staff said she was calm, even cheerful. When one aide asked if she thought the court would rule in her favor, she simply said, "The law will speak for itself." Weeks passed, then months. The decision still hadn't come. Legal experts speculated daily. Newspapers ran headlines like "Supreme Court divided on Voting Rights Act" and "Thomas and Crockett, the exchange that could change the law." Then, finally, word spread. The court would issue its decision on a Monday morning. Reporters began camping outside the court the night before. News channels prepared live coverage. Commentators filled the air with guesses. Some said the law would be struck down again. Others said it might survive. Inside the court that morning, the justices took their seats. The chamber filled quickly. The hum of whispers stopped as Chief Justice Roberts began to speak. The decision was ready. The room went quiet. Roberts announced the ruling calmly. In the case of Alabama versus the United States, the court upholds the central provisions of the Voting Rights Advancement Act, finding that Congress acted within its authority under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. Gasps rippled through the room. 6 votes to 3. The law survived. Then Roberts continued, "Justice Thomas has filed a separate concurring opinion." The room stirred again. It was rare, almost unheard of, for Thomas to write separately when the majority already reflected his concerns. Reporters leaned forward. Cameras clicked rapidly. In his opinion, Thomas acknowledged something extraordinary. He wrote that while he still believed in strict constitutional limits, Congress could indeed act when backed by real evidence and proportional remedies. "The record developed by Congress and the graduated structure of this legislation," he wrote, demonstrate how Section 5 authority can be exercised consistent with constitutional boundaries. Across the country, headlines exploded. Justice Thomas concedes ground. Crockett changes the conversation. It was official. A dialogue in the courtroom had shifted a justice's view. Even if only slightly, it was enough to make history. That night on cable news, constitutional experts debated what it meant. One said, "This is the first time in years we've seen a justice known for unshakable positions move toward the middle." Another replied, "It's not about politics, it's about respect." Crockett met him where he lived, in the law. In Congress, Crockett returned to her committee meetings quietly. When asked for comment, she simply said, "The court has spoken. Now we must live up to it." But behind that calm tone was something deeper. She knew this wasn't just about one case. It was about how America defines power and fairness. It was about what happens when reason meets respect, and how even in the highest court, listening can still change minds. And yet, the story wasn't over. What happened next would take the country by surprise. Because just as the celebration began, new evidence emerged. Evidence that would reopen old wounds and test everything Crockett had fought for. It started quietly, almost unnoticed. A junior clerk in the Department of Justice found a set of documents buried deep within a digital archive. The files were old but marked as updated. 2025, they contained data from several states showing recent changes in voting. Procedures, changes that had taken place just months after the court's ruling. At first it looked routine. But when investigators compared the data to the evidence Congress had used, something didn't match. Some of the reports cited by Congress had been altered. It wasn't clear who had done it. The original files were missing timestamps. But the differences were serious enough to raise questions about the integrity of the congressional record itself. In the political world, it was a spark in a dry forest. Within days, media outlets picked up the story. Headlines exploded across the country. Were voting rights reports altered before the Supreme Court hearing? Representative Jasmine Crockett saw the story as she arrived at her office early one morning. Her phone buzzed non-stop with messages. Staff members rushed in and out of her room, faces tight with worry. Her chief of staff, Marcus Lee, handed her a folder. "We just got this from the Department of Justice," he said quietly. "They're investigating the data sources used in the Act's record." Crockett sat down and opened the folder. Her heart sank. She recognized the files. They were part of the 850-page congressional record she had cited before the Supreme Court. The record that had convinced Justice Thomas. The foundation of everything. She turned page after page. Some numbers were different, minor differences, small changes in reported violations, but they mattered. Opponents could use this to say the evidence had been inflated, that Congress had exaggerated its case. Crockett knew instantly that the storm was coming. By noon, cable news was running the story non-stop. Commentators debated every angle. Some said it was a simple clerical error. Others said it was deliberate manipulation to strengthen the case for federal oversight. Critics demanded new hearings. That evening, Crockett appeared on live television for the first time since the Supreme Court decision. The host wasted no time. "Representative Crockett," he said, "these new reports suggest that some of the data you used in your argument before the court might have been inaccurate. Do you have any comment?" Crockett looked straight into the camera. Her voice was calm, but there was a quiet weight behind every word. "If there were errors," she said, "we'll find them and correct them. The truth matters more than any victory. But I will say this, the problems we addressed are real. The constitutional violations documented across states are real. This issue is bigger than a spreadsheet." Her honesty surprised people. Many expected denial or defensiveness. Instead, she chose transparency. For a moment, it calmed the public storm, but not for long. Within a week, a congressional oversight committee announced a formal inquiry. The same media that had once praised Crockett now filled with questions. Was the record trustworthy? Had Congress rushed to pass the law? And worst of all, had Crockett known about any inconsistencies before the hearing? Inside the Capitol, whispers spread quickly. Political opponents saw an opening. Allies grew nervous. The woman who had faced Justice Thomas without flinching was now being accused of misleading the court. Late one night, Crockett sat alone in her office. The city outside was quiet, lights from the dome of the Capitol shining through her window. She stared at the printed record on her desk, the same one she had studied for months before the Supreme Court hearing. Every page was marked with notes, highlighter, and tabs. She had read it 100 times. She knew it was accurate when she presented it. So how could it have changed? She called Marcus Lee into her office. "Marcus," she said softly, "I need you to find the original data. Every file, every draft. Go back to the committee servers. If something was altered, we'll trace it." Marcus nodded. "Yes, ma'am. But this could get ugly." Crockett smiled faintly. "It's already ugly," she said. "Now we find the truth." Over the next several days, her team worked tirelessly. They compared every version of the report, every digital signature, every metadata line. Finally, a pattern began to appear. A small group of staffers from an outside policy office had updated several charts before the final record was submitted. Their reason? To make the data more consistent. But in doing so, they had changed the accuracy of the findings. What looked like 3 violations now appeared as 10. It wasn't enough to destroy the law, but it was enough to cast doubt. Opponents seized on it. Late-night talk shows mocked it. 850 pages of evidence, one host joked, and they couldn't count straight. Meanwhile, Justice Thomas received the same reports. Inside his chambers, he sat with the news articles spread across his desk. For a long time, he said nothing. His law clerks waited quietly. Finally, Thomas spoke. "Even one wrong number," he said softly, "can shake the foundation of trust." But then he added, almost to himself, "And yet she argued the truth of principle, not just numbers." He closed the file and stared out the window. The nation outside was roaring with opinion. But in that small, quiet office, Thomas seemed to be thinking not as a judge, but as a man reflecting on a rare moment of dialogue he did not regret. Back on Capitol Hill, the committee hearings began. Cameras rolled as Crockett raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth. The chairwoman's tone was sharp. "Representative Crockett," she began, "did you personally review the data submitted in the final version of the congressional record?" "Yes," Crockett replied calmly, "every line of it." "Were you aware that changes were made before submission?" "No," Crockett said, "I was not. And if I had been, I would have stopped it." Her voice didn't shake. She looked directly at the committee members, even those who clearly wanted to see her fall. She explained the process, how drafts were reviewed, how evidence was verified, and how updates sometimes came from staff outside her team. By the time she finished, even some critics seemed unsure what to make of it. After hours of questioning, one senior member of the committee, a veteran congressman from Texas, leaned forward. "Representative Crockett," he said, "we may disagree politically, but I've been here a long time. You remind me of how we used to do things, with honesty and backbone. I don't see deceit here. I see a mistake and a willingness to fix it." That clip went viral overnight. Americans across the country shared it with captions like, "Integrity still exists in Washington, but not everyone was forgiving." A powerful senator announced a bill to repeal parts of the Voting Rights Advancement Act, citing compromised evidence. The fight that Crockett thought was over had begun again, this time in Congress instead of the court. Days later, a letter arrived in Crockett's office. The envelope was plain, marked "Chambers of Justice Clarence Thomas." Inside was a single sheet of paper typed in a neat font. It read, "Representative Crockett, we do not shape the truth. We uncover it, Our dialogue was one of the few moments in recent memory where argument rose above politics. Do not let temporary storms erase permanent principles. C. Thomas Crockett read the note twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. It was not an endorsement, not forgiveness, but something else. A quiet recognition. The months that followed were some of the hardest of her career. Investigations continued. Hearings dragged on. Political attacks filled the air. Yet through it all she kept showing up. She spoke in committees, gave town halls, and defended not herself but the law's purpose. She reminded everyone that the issue was never about her. It was about protecting constitutional rights with fairness and evidence. Slowly, the storm began to fade. The Justice Department completed its review. Their final report confirmed what Crockett had said all along. The data had been changed without her knowledge, and the overall conclusions of the law remained valid. When the report was made public, she didn't celebrate. She simply said, "The truth always wins, even if it takes time." But something else was happening quietly in the background. Scholars across the country began revisiting the Thomas Crockett Exchange, as it was now called in law schools. Professors used it to teach not just legal doctrine, but the power of civil discourse. "This," one professor told his students, "is how democracy corrects itself, not through shouting, but through dialogue." And yet one late evening, as Crockett prepared notes for a constitutional lecture she'd been invited to give at Harvard, a knock came at her office door. Marcus Lee stepped in, looking uneasy. "Ma'am," he said, holding up a tablet, "you need to see this." On the screen was a leaked memo, one that claimed a private law foundation had quietly funded parts of the original data collection used in the Voting Rights Act hearings. The same foundation had ties to powerful political donors. If the report was true, it meant the controversy wasn't over. It was just beginning again. Crockett stared at the screen, her expression unreadable. "Who leaked it?" she asked. "No one knows yet," Marcus said. "But the timing, it's too perfect. Someone wants this back in the headlines." Crockett leaned back in her chair. The glow from the monitor reflected in her eyes. "Then I guess," she said softly, "we're not done fighting for the truth." Outside, the lights of Washington flickered in the night. Somewhere in the distance, the Supreme Court stood in silence. Its marble walls holding memories of the day two voices had changed how America talked about power and justice. But now a new chapter was unfolding, and this time the battle would not be fought in a courtroom, but in the open court of public trust. Because once the truth begins to shake, it doesn't stop until everything is tested. The leaked memo hit Washington like a thunderclap. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Cable news anchors spoke over breaking news graphics. Online headlines flashed words like, "New funding scandal in Voting Rights Act," and "Did political money shape the data?" Every channel had a theory. Every pundit had a microphone. And in the center of it all was one name repeated over and over, Jasmine Crockett. At first, she said nothing. Her team urged her to stay quiet until they verified the information. But silence can be dangerous in politics. In a matter of hours, social media filled the void. Comment sections turned into war zones. Supporters defended her integrity. Critics declared her finished. By the second day, major networks were calling it the Crockett crisis. In her office, Crockett sat with Marcus Lee and a few trusted advisors. The leaked memo lay open on the table. It claimed that a private foundation, the Liberty Policy Trust, had provided early funding to the academic team that helped compile data for the Voting Rights Advancement Act. The trust had well-known ties to donors who had long supported voting reform efforts. "Marcus," Crockett said quietly, "this can't be true. That team was vetted. We checked every contributor." "I know," Marcus said, "but they're saying the foundation gave indirect funding, grants through a partner university. It looks bad even if it's legal." Crockett rubbed her temples. "It doesn't just look bad. It makes it look like the evidence was bought. They sat in silence. The weight of perception hung heavier than any fact. By nightfall, congressional committees announced another round of hearings, this time not about altered data, but about influence. Was the Voting Rights Advancement Act truly built on independent research, or had hidden donors shaped its foundation? The next morning, as Crockett arrived at the Capitol, reporters swarmed. Microphones pressed forward. Voices shouted her name. "Representative Crockett, did you know about the Liberty Policy Trust? Did they help fund your evidence? Did this money influence the Supreme Court case?" Crockett didn't answer. She walked straight through the crowd, her expression calm, almost stoic. Inside, however, her thoughts raced. Every step she took echoed with the same question: how much truth can survive when trust is broken twice? That night, she sat alone in her apartment, the city lights glimmering beyond the glass. She turned on the television just in time to see a panel of commentators discussing her case. One of them said, "She's either the most principled person in Washington or the most naive. Maybe both." She muted the sound. The quiet felt heavy. Then her phone buzzed. A private message from an unknown number. The text was short. "Meet me tomorrow, 9 a.m. outside the National Archives. I can prove who leaked the memo." For a moment she considered ignoring it, but something inside her, the same instinct that had guided her through law and politics, told her this mattered. The next morning, under the pale light of dawn, she arrived at the National Archives. The plaza was nearly empty, except for a man in a grey coat standing near the fountain. When she approached, he turned slightly, revealing a familiar face, one of her former legal aides from years earlier. "Evan?" she said in disbelief. He nodded nervously. "I shouldn't even be here," he said. "But you need to know that leak wasn't random. Someone inside the Liberty Policy Trust planted it. They wanted to discredit the law. They're building a case to challenge it again in court." Crockett felt her pulse quicken. "Why tell me this?" "Because I was part of it," Evan said, voice trembling. "I thought it was just political strategy. But they've gone further. They're working with state officials to file new lawsuits claiming Congress overstepped its power. They want to undo everything." She stared at him for a long moment. "Do you have proof?" He handed her a flash drive. "Everything's on there. Emails, drafts, funding routes. But if they find out I gave it to you..." Crockett stopped him gently. "They won't. Thank you, Evan." As he walked away, she looked at the small device in her hand. Inside it, she knew, might be the key to protecting the law, or the spark that could ignite an even bigger fire. Back at her office, she loaded the flash drive. The files were detailed: financial records, internal memos, and emails between executives of the Liberty Policy Trust. The messages were clear. They had funneled money through universities to subtly influence how data was presented to Congress. It wasn't illegal, but it was deeply unethical. And worst of all, they were planning to use their own manipulation as grounds to claim the law was tainted. Marcus read over her shoulder. "This could expose them all," he said. "But it'll also drag the act right back into controversy." Crockett leaned back in her chair. "If we hide it, we're no better than them. We tell the truth, all of it." The next morning, she called a press conference. Cameras filled the briefing room. The world watched live as she stepped to the podium. "There are moments," she began, her tone calm but powerful, "when doing what's right costs more than staying silent. Today is one of those moments. Documents have come to my attention, showing that outside groups attempted to influence data used in the Voting Rights Advancement Act. I did not know. My staff did not know. But the truth will not stay buried, no matter who it hurts." She paused. The room was dead quiet. "I will be turning all of this evidence over to the Department of Justice. I will also introduce legislation to ban third-party funding in future congressional research. This isn't about me. It's about trust, the foundation of every law we make." The reporters erupted in questions. but she walked off the stage without answering a single one. By nightfall, her speech dominated every news channel. Some praised her courage, others called it political suicide. A few accused her of grandstanding, but in homes across America, people saw something rare, a politician refusing to hide behind excuses. Justice Clarence Thomas saw it too. Sitting in his study, he watched the press conference replay on the evening news. As the camera zoomed in on Crockett's calm face, he whispered quietly to himself, "Truth over victory." He reached for a notebook on his desk and wrote a single line, "Principle remains the last defense against chaos." In the following weeks, the Department of Justice opened a formal investigation into the Liberty Policy Trust. Subpoenas were issued. Executives were called to testify. The evidence from the flash drive matched records on government servers. It became clear that the Foundation had deliberately created the controversy to weaken the law. The revelation shook Washington to its core. Commentators now called it the data scandal that backfired. Public opinion shifted once again. People who had doubted Crockett began to see her as a symbol of integrity, a person who faced every storm and never ran. Letters poured into her office, handwritten notes from retirees, teachers, veterans, and young law students. One letter, written in neat cursive by an elderly woman from Ohio, read, "You reminded me that honesty still matters. My husband used to say courage isn't loud, it's steady. You were steady and we saw it." Crockett kept that letter on her desk. Every time the noise of politics grew too loud, she read it again. Months later, when the Justice Department released its final report, it confirmed what she had fought to prove. The data manipulation had been engineered by outside actors, not by Congress. The Voting Rights Advancement Act, though battered by controversy, remained constitutional and intact. The same week, the Supreme Court declined to rehear the case. The law stood. And in a surprising move, Justice Thomas issued a short statement concurring with the decision. It was only 2 sentences long. Truth requires both courage and humility. The court acknowledges the importance of both in the preservation of constitutional order. Legal scholars immediately recognized the reference, a quiet nod to Crockett. That evening, as the sun set behind the Capitol dome, Jasmine Crockett walked the long marble hallway toward her office. The building was nearly empty, her footsteps echoing softly. She paused by a window overlooking the city. Washington stretched out before her, glowing, restless, and eternal. She thought about everything that had happened, the courtroom battle, the media storms, the investigations, the sleepless nights. She thought about the young staffers who had worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, and the quiet letter from Ohio that reminded her why she had started this fight. Marcus approached from behind. "They're calling your name on every network again," he said with a smile. "Only this time it's not scandal. It's respect," Crockett smiled faintly. "Respect is nice," she said. "But I'd rather have progress." Marcus nodded. "What now?" "Now," she said, looking out at the night sky, "we keep working. Because laws are just words until people give them meaning." Weeks later, she stood before a crowded audience at the National Constitution Center, delivering a lecture on democracy and integrity. Her voice was steady, her tone simple. "We talk often about power," she said, "but rarely about responsibility. The Constitution doesn't belong to any branch, party, or person. It belongs to all of us. And it survives not through perfection, but through honesty." The crowd stood and applauded. Among them were students, judges, and even a few quiet members of Congress who had once doubted her. For that brief moment, the noise of politics faded, and something older and something purer filled the room. As the applause died down, Crockett glanced at the back row. Sitting there, almost hidden in the shadows, was a familiar figure. Justice Clarence Thomas, quiet as ever, gave her a small, respectful nod. For a moment their eyes met, the justice and the congresswoman who had once stood on opposite sides of a constitutional storm. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The nod said everything. The argument had ended, but the dialogue would live on. Later that night, Crockett walked alone through the quiet streets of Washington. The air was cool, and the distant lights of the Supreme Court glowed faintly against the dark sky. She paused at the steps, looking up at the grand pillars. It was here, she thought, that everything had begun. The questions, the confrontation, the silence that turned into understanding. She whispered softly, "Truth always finds its way home." Then she smiled and turned away, disappearing into the calm night. The marble court stood behind her, timeless and still, a silent witness to a rare moment when courage met integrity. And the Constitution itself became more than words on a page. Because in the end, justice isn't just decided in courts or in Congress. It lives in those who dare to tell the truth, even when it costs them everything. The marble court stood silent, bathed in the soft glow of the Washington night. The story of Justice Clarence Thomas and Representative Jasmine Crockett had ended, not with victory or defeat, but with understanding. Two voices from different worlds had met in the middle, and for one rare moment in time, truth had spoken louder than power. Because in the end, justice is not only about laws or courts, it's about courage, the kind that stands tall when silence would be easier. It's about those who dare to speak honestly, even when the world watches with doubt. And that's what Jasmine Crockett did. She faced the highest court in the land, challenged tradition, defended truth, and reminded America that the Constitution lives only when people have the heart to protect it. As the lights of Washington faded into the night, one thing became clear. Moments like this don't just change laws, they change history. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it reminded you that truth still matters in our world, don't let it stop here. Hit the like button. It helps this story reach more people who still believe in fairness and integrity. Comment below where you're watching from and what you think justice really means today. Your thoughts make this channel stronger. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to stay with us for more real stories of power, truth, and the moments that shape America. Every view, every comment, and every share helps keep this channel alive. A place where facts meet humanity. And stories like this one continue to be told. This is Trend Debate Room, reminding you, truth never fades. It waits. For those brave enough to speak it, thank you for watching. See you in the next story.